Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Capgemini offices in Barcelona. So today we have a very special podcast on architecting agents for the enterprise. And today with me, I have two special guests. So on the right-hand side, I have Rohan Curran. Rohan Curran is the principal analyst for Forrester Research, specializing in AI applications and data science.
Thank you so much for having me.
Very nice to have you here. On the left-hand side, I have Raul Bartolome. Raul Bartolome has come from Madrid to Barcelona.
Far away.
Far away. And Raul is a global portfolio lead for AI applications for the industry. So Very nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me here.
And there is also myself. I am Itziar Goicoechea, and I'm leading the Agentic offer within Capgemini. Maybe to kick off the discussion, I would say, what do you think it requires to make Agentic AI ready at the enterprise level? So I don't know, do you want to start, Rohan, to get the conversation?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think the way that I would frame this is actually something, it's kind of a bit of the way that I framed generative AI when all of that kicked off in 2023. And with Agentic AI, it's really, the thought to have around it is that it's very easy to get started in Agentic AI, but it's very hard to get going.
Yeah.
And so what we've seen overall, especially in the past, 6-9 months, even the past year, is that there's a ton of enterprises who have been, making a lot of, initial POCs and pilots, but have really been struggling to actually bring it to the level of trust, availability, and security that they need for enterprise deployments. And I think a couple of the things that we're seeing constraining that are around, basic things like data and infrastructure. So one of the big questions around an agentic AI system is what information is it going to be querying, accessing, and then what sort of transactions is it going to be doing? And a lot of these agentic use cases so far, they've been mostly focused around what we call agentic RAG, retrieval augmented generation, where essentially the agent is, retrieving information, allowing a human to make a better decision, but not necessarily taking full-blown action on the other side. And for that type of use case, most people are using unstructured data, and they're using things like vector databases and whatnot to return the information. Now, in order to do that, you have to take all of your unstructured data, which might be stored in tables or, columnar databases, whatever it is, and then create embeddings from that can then be vectorized and searched. And that whole process itself is a discipline that a lot of enterprises are not particularly familiar with. So even before getting to the full-blown agentic stage, a lot of enterprises are figuring out how to get their data set up.
Even if you have the smartest agent, if it's not fully integrated, then it's not going to work. It's not going to do the work it is supposed to be doing. So, yeah, the integration is super important as well.
Absolutely. And actually, you're touching all the points. The way I see it, just to complement what you're saying, is it's really important, and you touch upon that. Because it's true, you feed the system with a lot of information and you allow the system to integrate it with different tools. But what is the security level that every agent should have in order to actually do that? Because, and that's the tricky part as well, no? How you're going to be managing your agents, and that's what everybody's trying to say, no? Using them as employees, and therefore they have to have their own identity based on the role that they're going to be playing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So that is going to be key, because they're not really tackling that. And for a POC, that's fantastic, but when you want to scale,
100%.
It's like, all right, this is going to get to all my data, and it's going to be able to actually go to all my tools and do whatever it wants to do.
That's 100%.
It has to be trustful, no? And so that's one thing that everybody needs to be aware of and think from the very beginning how you want to do that, no? But secondly would be also, you also mentioned about the KPIs and what are the goals that you're willing to achieve with this system. And this is also very important because, and this is something that actually I'm pretty sure you have experienced as well, no? With Gen AI and with previous systems. I mean, when we were talking about machine learning and these other systems, what's the purpose? What is the challenge you want to solve? It needs to be something that actually is meaningful for the business. Otherwise, when you can demonstrate actually the technology is really good, it's really powerful, but if we want to take this to production, it needs to have a ROI behind. No, you need to be able to really measure that, and that is a tricky piece because sometimes it was more a technology project than a real business project. And business needs to be involved. One of the good things about this new Gen AI and now agentic thing is that business is actually able to really talk to these systems and therefore understand more the complexity, how it works, and the value that they can get out of that. No? And that's something that has been changing, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think you touched on something with the integration piece also that I think a lot of enterprises maybe think about this a little backwards, where they start with this vision of an agent that can do anything, that can, touch all the enterprise systems, can execute entire workflows. But what we've seen is, people tend to have much more success if, as you were saying, you target very specific workflows, very specific outcomes. And the way I view it is basically we have people starting to build these more atomic agents that are targeted for specific workflows. You can measure the outcomes. And I think we'll see over the course of the next, couple years, these atomic agents then being orchestrated and governed by meta agents that sit on top of them. So I think we're going to have these, much more specific, task by task oriented agents that allow you to have much more control, much more security and governance, but then also start to roll it up into higher level tasks. But when you have these more atomic components, then you can actually have, folks like your application development team, your business process management teams actually understand, okay, what is happening in each of these flows and how do we control what the outcomes are?
I think that's totally key, like having very atomic parts in order to backtrack, because in the end, when you want to monitor and evaluate, you don't only want to evaluate the final outcome, you want to evaluate the whole and understand what led to that final outcome, the whole decision points of the agent. So that's super relevant when tracking systems. And I think also in terms of another point that you touched, or that you were touching upon, or it was you, Raul, of the security. It's super key, and I think it's a very tricky one, because when you start configuring agents, initially, for example, you have your agent in your enterprise that it's in one department, you might give that agent some policies. Let's say this agent is working for HR, so to say, but then the same agent, if it goes to finance, might need other type of policies, right? And it's the same agent, so it might type other type of access. So it's not something that is static. I think we also need to think in terms of this type of access, role-based access policies are dynamic with agents at the enterprise level. They might evolve. So that adds another layer of complexity when building agents. It's not something static. An agent does that, has this right. No, it can change with time, depending on the circumstances, etc. So I think that's a tricky one from what I see. And I don't see many tools also that enable that, this dynamically automation of setting up those policies and controls of your agents. So I think that's an evolving field for sure.
Yeah.
And there is a big trick here, because at some point, I'm pretty sure at some point we're starting to master that and to be able to really see how we can actually make these agents flexible and dynamic. But how do you test that then afterwards? That is the next challenge, no? Because this is at the end something that is not deterministic. And you, I was reading an article the other day, talking about how you at the end are engaging with this using your language, and depending on how you actually do your language, it behaves in one way or the other. And even when you want to retrain some things, you really need to test it again using your own language. But you're never sure of how much it has really learned or changed the behavior based on what you did, because it's a completely different paradigm, not for testing, for making sure that at the end everything you just set up and or how you have make this more dynamic if it's actually working and not going wrong, at some point doing whatever it shouldn't be doing. And that's the next challenge as well.
I think so too.
And I think that to me is the testing aspect, but also the security aspect are, I would say, the two biggest constraints on scaling enterprise deployment of agents at this point in time, at least in terms of enterprises feeling confident in that. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that, in evaluating and testing agents, there's really two options at this point in time. You can have a bunch of human evaluators kind of look at the content and say, is this good? Is this bad? Let's give feedback. And there's various degrees of providing, feedback and reinforcement on that. Or you can have some type of LLM as a judge type of situation, look at the outputs and validate them. But even in that latter situation, you still need to have that evaluator tested and verified. And so what we're seeing is, there's really, a significant amount of human effort that has to go into the alignment of these agents to enterprise needs. And I think that's something that a lot of us are going to have to, either reckon with in terms of how we are rolling out agents, or hopefully the market will provide more tools on this. But I have to say that this is one of the areas where I see a lot of people having to, use some vendor tools, but also then, just work a lot on their
I
own to
think
develop the capabilities.
Definitely, it's pretty manual yet, and I think it's one of the. I would love to see more tools on that space because it's a lot, as you were saying, LLM as a judge, but then who judges the LLM? Who proves that the LLM is right, and then otherwise a lot of human effort. So I don't think we have an ideal situation. And also the other day I was reading of the amount of investments that go into different areas of building LLMs, etc. There is a lot of investment in creating new models, etc., but not so much in creating new evaluation tools. And I think that's key. And I would love to see more tools so that in the end, to scale, we need this trust, and this is key.
Going agentic is not just technology. Definitely, you need to step back and think twice what you want to do with it. What you want to, how you want to really make it part of your organization, of your company, of your business, in order to really set up the things properly to be successful when you scale. Because one thing is one small piece for one department, whatever, but then if somebody else, everything we're talking about here, when somebody else come and start using it, it can actually inject whatever to start tracking information that shouldn't be able to access, all these things. You need to secure that. And it all comes always, and I know it's not sexy, the data and the data state and how you have your data managed and governed across your organization. That is key at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And they need to go back and think about that to use this. No?
That's a foundational pillar. I've seen few clients that they want to go agentic without having the proper data infrastructure in place, which is like, you really need that before thinking level 3, you need to have level 1 there. So definitely, Raul.
Yeah, but I think, and it's something that I also tell all the time, you don't really have to have the whole house built complete to actually go agentic. But you need to have the maps at least.
Yeah, for sure.
The foundations and the maps where you want to go, because you need to solve some of the questions that we're having here, at least theoretically.
Yeah.
And then you know your path, no? And then you start building your agents, you start transforming your data state, and how you really, and you get the return on everything you're doing, which is really important, not to have the return in 5 years or 10 years. No, in months. No, actually, this accelerates everything. But you need to have very clear where you want to go. No, that is the key thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, because I think a lot of enterprises either go too hard on the use case by use case approach to agents, or they say, we're just going to build a new platform to do this whole thing. And, the first approach, gets you lots of maybe good little agents, but how are you going to put them together, orchestrate them in the version 2, version 3? And the latter approach, that might slow you down and, make you not able to release something for, 6 months, a year, or however long it is. And I think what we've seen be successful with folks is when they take a two-pronged approach where they are doing more of these use cases to attack, individual workflows that they can identify at the same time they're building, more resilience and broader data governance into their platform. And I think one aspect around the scaling of this is that we're seeing a lot of enterprises get agents from, various application providers, various CRM companies, workflow companies, and whatnot, and those are all within each of those companies, technological umbrella, for lack of a better term. And so the need to have mindfulness towards how are we actually going to orchestrate these things together, how are we going to govern them, that is a really important part of the mid and long-term scaling, which also goes to the MCP and A2A question, which, on the security aspect of that, we have seen, significant advances in terms of the capabilities in MCP, but I think it's important to recognize that this is the exact same thing we've seen in every other software area where we build really cool stuff and then we say, oh, security? All right, let's figure that out. Once it's already built and deployed,
it comes after. It's an
exactly, and I think that's what we've seen with MCP, where it was originally designed to help developers who are building agentic systems not have to hard code every single tool call, every single data reference. But, there was not a lot of security around that. And interestingly, what I've seen is, a non-zero amount of companies saying, all right, it's nice to use MCP or some of these other tool calling capabilities, but we do actually want to hard code some of these tool calls into our agent to really make sure that at this step of the workflow, it's only calling out to, this particular customer data system or something of that nature. And I think that again goes to the needing to think about the hybrid nature of these things, that it is going to be, a lot of, the more flexible future agentic systems, but there's going to be components that need to be more tightly constrained within that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And guardrails, they're going to be icky.
Yes, and
hierarchy.
and guardrails, I think, is very important for folks to recognize that that's a combination of, business rules, prompting to the LLM, but also, non-deterministic controls on the back end.
Yeah.
So saying like, okay, if we're producing an output from an agent that is supposed to call, a SQL database or something like that, run it through some type of, SQL verifier overall to just say, okay, is this actually like a well-constructed query? Is this actually going to run? That's not, an agentic capability. That's just,
rules, basically. Yeah. I see, like with the guardrails, is a very important topic, and I think its company organization will need to define their own guardrails. So it's not something. I mean, for sure, you can take repositories of guardrails, libraries, ingest them somehow, but then it's so much specific to your process. You need to know your process. You need to know what is the business logic, etc. What makes sense, doesn't make sense. So I think in the end, it makes a lot of sense that enterprises will create their own guardrails for their specific processes. Yeah. Yeah.
In the same way that you do with their business rules today.
Yeah,
I mean, you get a business rules engine, you write your
business rule in the end.
Yeah.
It is.
It's something that you don't leave out for chance. It's like,
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe also to follow up on that, when we see enterprises scaling, what do you see it changes when we go from 4 or 5 agents, that is something maybe the what we see at the moment, to thousands of agents. We talked a lot about integration, governance at scale. What other things that you think as well we need to take into consideration when scaling at that level?
For me, there is something critical beyond everything we're talking about here. It's reusability. Because at the end, cost is critical. It's going to be critical. And you don't want yourself to be reinventing the wheel every time you go with some idea of how to use an agent. So how to actually govern that as a company to understand what everybody is doing and how much you can start reusing or adapting this dynamic thing you were talking before, no? That is going to be key. Otherwise, your cost is going to be skyrocket, and you need to be able to actually reuse as much as of what you have, because not only for cost, but also because at some point when you have something that is actually working, you want to keep using what is working now, not starting again from scratch and learning from scratch. So that's
so automation of agents,
automation and
automation of those processes, like, because you can somehow do things manually with 4 agents here, write a policy here, write a guardrail there. But if you go thousands, this is not scalable, right? So you really need to automate how you manage them.
But it's beyond automate, making more automatic. It's reusability, and it comes with the discovery, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, who is doing what in my organization? It may sound silly, but it's not at all. At the end, you don't really have the visibility of what everybody's doing. Or even worse, coming back to security, what they are granting access to. So that is going to be key, making sure that you have that visibility, that you have the possibility to really see everything that is happening, how it is happening. And then comes the question on how to govern that, and it can be centralized or it can be more a distributed system. What we're seeing more or less is that distributed systems are more flexible. It's true that you need to have very well define your business guardrails and your rules and define everything we were talking about, and so everybody can actually work on that and contribute to that, rather than having a central entity that actually is managing everything. Because that, at the end of the day, we're talking about systems that are really fast and it's very easy to really put them up and running. If you start going central and you really slow down everything, it's more complicated to really use the speed you can gain, and that comes with the organization. Because at the end of the day, and something that is also important, is that you need to enable your organization to really understand what is agentic, how they can use agentic, and why this is good for them. So the change management of all this through a central system is more complicated through a distributed system. So these are the things that are right now on the table.
You touched a very important point, the change management regarding agents. So it's not, we've been talking a lot about technology, but we also need to make sure like we empower people how to work with agents, that they feel confident working with agents. So that's a very, very big topic.
They talk about that,
Yeah. And before we get to that, I just wanted to touch on the
too many points.
To the central versus distributed piece. I think that putting this out into individual teams with subject matter experts to support the honing of the agents to the particular use case, I think that makes very much sense. When we talk to folks, whenever they're bringing the subject matter experts earlier in the process developing these things, it ends up being a much better outcome. But I think it is also important to, look to tools that are going to allow for the visibility and discovery to be a bit more centralized. Because to your point, we're already seeing, organizations that, deploy a bunch of agents and then people don't use a lot of them. And if you don't have, a nice dashboard that's saying, all right, agent, 123 has only been used one time in the past month and it's running a recurring task like every day and updating, is it really worth it to keep that agent running? I mean, in my personal life, I have a number of, scheduled jobs for my personal agent that I don't look at, half of them at this point in time, and that's just wasting resources right now. And I think, that's very different for me than for an enterprise, but having visibility into exactly what folks are using that, helps manage the resources, but then it also can help with that change management aspect and understanding, okay, what actually resonates with end users and how can they use them. But also on that change management aspect, I think one thing we really need to see, enterprises deeply invest in, and not just, initially, but over time, is in educating people on how to leverage, improve, and interrogate these agents. So understanding, what is the path to understanding when it's correct and when it is incorrect about what it's doing. And I think a lot of enterprises think about the training aspect of, okay, we're going to have this very high initial cost and then it'll drop down to zero, as with, previous software. We train people to use it as good and they just go. Really what we see in the agentic space is that, and it's coming out of the generative space as well, is that, you have initial costs that then, drops down to a certain level, but there is still a continuous need to invest in change management almost perpetually at this point in time. And I feel like maybe we've said that for one or two other technological explosions in the past 15 years, but it's really, really true with the agentic space. There is no clear horizon where this stuff slows down in terms of the rate of change. And so it's going to be really necessary to help all of our, ourselves as well as our colleagues and employees to adapt to that continuously over time.
Definitely. On the change management is a very, very important topic. I also wanted to talk about a little bit on cases, on agentic cases that we see that are resonating with organizations. What do we see that are very demanded agentic cases? What's the industry going to in terms of applications? From what I see in Capgemini, maybe you can also help me, Raul, I see a lot of internal facing applications, a lot more than actually facing external in the client. And I think that makes sense in order, because it's a new field, right? So you want to start internally before you make it external. So I think that makes sense. So I see a lot of things like, for example, document processing, document intelligence, so extracting information out of any type of document. You see that across any industry, right? Across every function. I've seen that in pharma, in automotive, in finance. So every that's a very common one. I see a lot of invoice processing as well, similarly related to that. Another very common one is research agents. So deep research agents, the one that can go through thousands of documents in the organization, extract information, summarize them, critique them, make insights out of them. So that's a very typical one. We had a few clients also with that, like, for example, one that was doing risk analysis, and actually a risk analyzer was in the end somehow a research agent that was going through hundreds of thousands, well, I don't know if thousands, but few hundreds of documents at least, and trying to summarize and actually speed up the process and make it even more efficient. So that's something that I see a lot. Code generation, also very, very common one. I would say these are very, very common ones that I see. What do you see as well?
Something that I'm seeing is that when we all started talking about Gen AI, generative AI, everybody was like, I want to use it, and they didn't know what for. And that was the problem, the main problem. No? After a few years playing with this, it was like, all right, I don't see the benefit, because where can, give me use cases. I remember clients coming up, give me use cases. What are the others doing? No, and I want to do, give me ideas. And it was like, no, but then Agentic came in. And the good thing about Agentic is that actually you can pick up processes. So it's not just about use cases anymore, it's about processes. And so we see, for example, you were talking about risk management before. And one of the key things, talking with a client, actually it's a loan company, provides loans to clients, etc. And they have this process to really go through all the documentation to analyze the risk. And once the risk is confirmed, really get the signatures for everybody, create the documentation, and then, the whole process. And with Agentic, it's very easy to actually say, no, you don't need Gen AI, you need Agentic, which will include Gen AI, not only Gen AI, other tools, but thanks to Agentic, you're able to really take this piece and this piece and this piece of the process and then accelerate this dramatically. And instead of having some people just going for the signature of somebody and then sending emails to somebody, the agent is able to do these kind of things, no? And that changed completely the way they, and that's why I was saying before, the business now is really able to really see this, because then they understand that their process can really accelerate thanks to Agentic, no? And that's really when things are accelerating, because it's not just about GenAI anymore. It's not about I'm able to pick up a document, a PDF, and extract the key words and the key things and make me a summary. No, it goes beyond that, no? Because actually there is a purpose for doing that and then accelerating. No? So that's for me the main change I'm seeing. Everything is more about the process and how we can actually use Agentic to really accelerate the processes. No?
Yeah.
That's.
What about you, Rohan? What do you see at Forrester?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what you were just saying, where people are getting more focused on, I mean, they may call them use cases, but it's more about how do I improve XYZ step in this process. And I think one thing that or a couple of different ways that we're seeing this in the IT support management space. You know, we see a lot of use cases where people are starting to automate, you know, just end user requests and stuff like that. But we're also getting to the point where, you know, we're seeing some use cases where, or some deployments of Agentic where people are allowing an agent to basically use a remote access tool to like unlock a user's computer that would normally have to have a human involved in it. We're also seeing lots of use cases in the HR space. And this is more so when people are buying the agents, but, you know, I can go onto my HR system and I can use natural language to say, hey, you know, I'm going to, you know, Barcelona for a couple of weeks. I need to like set up my PTO. Can you create, you know, the form for it? And then the agent will go and, you know, fill out that entire form for me, but then come back and check with me as the end user and say, is this really what you want to do? Click yes if it is. And I think that's sort of, you know, bring me all the information to make a better decision and then show me the click to actually make that decision is, I would say, one of the best ways that we're seeing agents implemented today. Because when we look at, you know, the potential of agents, you know, you can apply it to any workflow you want, but whether it's actually going to do that workflow accurately enough for an enterprise outcome, I think that's the big question. And I think that's also why we sort of seen you know, an asymmetry in the way this stuff is deployed. Because, you know, we are seeing a lot of like code gen and other types of software developer support uses of Agentic. But in those use cases, it's a software developer who's still going through their normal development process where you're going to have, you know, testing and QA, et cetera, on the actual code so that it, you know, is verified to the level that you want. But, you know, we're not necessarily seeing folks deploy Agentic AI, let's say, I know of another loan situation, you know, where it's customer facing, but it's not, you know, running the entire loan approval process. It's basically allowing for a, I forget what the exact term is, but like the pre-approval of a loan, like before the bank actually has to make any financial commitments or send money, but it still like saves a lot of time and effort on the bank's part because they don't have to have humans interact with the potential customer. But it's still just, you know, collating all this information, making an initial decision saying, okay, we pre-approve you, but we're not actually launching this yet. So I think there's a lot of use cases, but the limits of them today tend to be hemmed in by these issues of security and trust that we've been talking
100%.
About a lot.
Yeah, I think actually that's a good point, which is what we all call the human in the loop, no?
Yeah.
But it's true. I mean, and something that we're seeing, and you were mentioning that before, no? It's internal use cases, external use cases. Why more internal than external? Because, first of all, we don't want to stop controlling the interaction with the clients. At the end of the day, they are important, no? So we need to have somebody at the end who is really granting, checking, no, that actually this is the right thing. So enhancing the humans so the human can take the right decision is key. And having this human, no, preparing all the documentation, everything automatically, that at the end the human is able to say yes. It depends also on the level of the risk that the process and the use cases may have. Because there will be some things that actually you can definitely say, no, the agent can do this on its own. There are many, that you just need to have some kind of system that at some point triggers something, if some kind of alarm, if it's going to a tool that it shouldn't be going, something like that. But in general, you can let it go. And other things more when we're facing humans, clients at the end, where we definitely need to have the human in the loop. And that is key, no? How do you define that? Again, I come back to the fact that you need to have very clear your business processes and how you want to do this and the role that everybody will be playing, no?
100%.
And at the end of the day, human need to be there. Also for ethics, at some point, there are some things that humans should always take, no? Some decisions that humans should always take.
Yeah. So definitely, I think that's a very nice closing point that in the end, it's humans, right, who should have, at least at this stage, the end word. And I think it's in the end also enterprises that need to define like when and what type of what point in the processes the humans need to jump in. So I think that's also something important that enterprises need to define themselves. So yeah, I think we had a super nice conversation. We touched upon a lot of topics. Agents, governance of agents, security in agents, what does it take to scale agents, use cases. So I think that we're going to see a lot of traction. I'm sure if we meet again in a couple of months, the whole world of agents will be at a different state. The space is changing. So it's a very exciting moment to work on this space. So thank you so much, Rohan, for joining us.
No, thank you,
Raul,
Itziar, for having us here.
Yeah, of
Thank
course.
you so much. This has been
And
great.
looking forward for a potentially next conversation in a few months.